Heroes of Israel by Willaim Blaikie. Chapter 6. The Rescue of Lot. Genesis chapter 14. The choice of Lot, when he separated from Abram, brought troubles on him and his household that he had not taken into his calculation. He had forgot that where the carcass is, thither the eagles are gathered together, and that the richer a country is, the more likely it is to be attacked and plundered. There was another consideration even more important than this, that he does not appear to have thought of. The valley of the Jordan forms part of the direct route between the north and the south, between the region of the Euphrates and the region of the Nile, and the command of this valley was essential for those men of the north who desired access to Egypt, whether for purposes of commerce or for purposes of war. Before Lot settled in Sodom, a confederacy of northern kings had attacked and overcome the kings or chiefs of Sodom and the neighboring cities or states. And for 12 years the Canaanite kings remained quietly in subjection, paying no doubt the stipulated tribute. In the 13th year they rebelled, and in the 14th came Chedorlaomer and his allies for the purpose of subduing the rebellion and regaining their control of the Jordan Valley. The chapter which contains this story has all the appearance of a separate narrative, written perhaps at the time and afterwards incorporated into the book of Genesis. Lot is introduced as, quote, Abram's brother's son, end quote, as if we had not been told this before. Abram is called, quote, the Hebrew, end quote, and we are told that he was living in the plain of Mamre, facts which would have been assumed in a continuous narrative. In the interval between the two writings, some places had changed their names, and we are told that Bela is the same as Zoar, the Vale of Siddim is the Salt Sea, and En-Mishpat is Kadesh. Respecting these confederate kings little is known. Chedorlaomer of Elam was evidently the leader of the second expedition, showing that Elam was then superior to Babylon. Now, the Elamites, as we have seen, were a people of Semitic race, while the Canaanites were Cushite, so that the expedition was in the line of those Semitic conquests which had already subdued the Cushite Akkadians, and it had for its object more and more to assert Semitic supremacy in the east. The Canaanite kings of Sodom and the plain were the natural foes of the Shemites. The northern confederates could not count on their friendship in any expedition which drew them towards Egypt. They had consequently made war on them, and obtained by the sword the control of their country. But the kings of the plain could not brook subjection, and some time after Lot came among them they rebelled. If they reckoned that Chedorlaomer would not undertake a distant expedition for an object of so pressing importance, they were mistaken. Chedorlaomer and his allies mustered in force, and by a circuitous route set out to compel the submission of the plain. Crossing probably from Mesopotamia to Damascus, the Allies first attacked the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, that is, Ashtaroth of the two horns or crescent, a city that derived its name from Ashtoreth or Astarte, the Phoenician goddess of the moon. This place comes afterwards into notice as a chief city of Og, king of Bashan, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 4, Joshua chapter 12 verse 4, and was included in the territory of the Transjordanic half-tribe of Manasseh. As the invaders marched southwards, the Zuzims in Ham and the Emims in Shabi Kiriathaim were next attacked, formidable foes in what was afterwards the tribe of Reuben, and then the Horites or cave-dwellers in Mount Seir, inhabiting the rocky mountains afterwards occupied by the descendants of Esau, whose chief city, Petra, still exhibits remarkable samples of houses excavated from the rock. It was the policy of the invaders to subdue these tribes on the east of the Jordan, in order to prepare the way for their getting undisturbed possession of the Jordan Valley itself. They then attacked the Amalekites and Amorites on the south border of Canaan, after subduing whom they turned northward as far as Hazazon Tamar, afterwards En-Gedi, on the west of the Dead Sea. All was now ready for the encounter with the kings of the plain. In their march from En-Gedi to Sodom, the invaders must have passed within a few miles of Abram, for Hebron is less than 20 miles west of En-Gedi. The battle was fought, quote, in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea, end quote. Quote, "The Vale of Siddim," end quote, is one of those expressions which have always puzzled commentators. Neither the word itself nor any notice elsewhere throws light on its precise situation. If we take the words as they stand, they would seem to imply that it was a plain now covered by the Dead Sea, as Josephus asserts. But whether at the northern or southern end is uncertain. The northern kings, flushed with their successive victories over the Rephaims, the Zuzims, the Emims, the Horites, the Amalekites, and the Amorites, at last encountered the king of Sodom and his allies. The Vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, or pits of bitumen, and may have been chosen by the Sodomite kings, as Bannockburn with its concealed pits was chosen by the Scots, as likely to embarrass an enemy ignorant of the ground. But the invaders made their attack with such determined vigour that the pits designed to entangle them proved the destruction of the defenders. The result of the battle was the total rout of the Sodomite allies and the abandonment of their homes and all that they contained to the enemy. Everything capable of removal was carried off by the victors. Lot, who does not appear to have been engaged in the battle, was carried off, probably mounted on one of his own camels, or driven on foot with his hands tied behind his back. Demoralized by sensuality, the people of the plain seem to have made a wretched resistance, such of them as were not killed flying to the mountains without any attempt to rally, and leaving their families and possessions to the tender mercies of the enemy, which were, no doubt, cruel enough. Neither bravery nor chivalry could be looked for among a people so utterly degraded as those were by sensual vice. For the invaders, everything seemed to succeed to a wish. But just as their triumph was complete, danger came to them from a totally unexpected quarter. Quote, "One that had escaped came and told Abram." End quote. He was living some 20 miles from the scene of the disaster, but to render any assistance to his nephew was a serious matter. Abram had never been accustomed to war. His people were shepherds, no doubt trained when necessary to encounter wild beasts, and skilled in weapons used against them, but not accustomed to fight with men. And the flocks could not be left long to take care of themselves. They needed day by day the care of the shepherds. And how could Abram expect success in battle against these confederate kings? Had they not swept foe after foe before them, and triumphed on every successive field? Was it not just to throw away his own life and the lives of his people, to attack an enemy of such valour and vigour? Was not the calamity of Lot the retribution of Providence on his foolish choice? And ought he not to be left to reap as he had sown? It was just a case in which an ordinary man would have folded his hands and said, quote, "I told you so," end quote. But the nobility of Abram's soul rose to the occasion. That Lot had treated him shabbily was nothing. That he was now reaping the fruit of his own folly was nothing. That Abram's servants were needed for other work was nothing. That the enterprise was dangerous and difficult and even impossible was still nothing, if God should be with them. The one thing clear to Abram was that an attempt should be made to rescue Lot. Blood was thicker than water. His brother's son must not end his life as a slave. His old associate and friend must not be abandoned without one blow struck in his behalf. Very chivalrous and highly sentimental considerations, some would say, but utterly impracticable, and therefore most unreasonable. Not unreasonable to Abram, however, for he had the faith that removes mountains. If God called him to this undertaking, he would strengthen him and carry him through. Abram was the father of the faithful, and the faith which now triumphed under the oak of Mamre was of the same calibre with that which 1,000 years later fortified the young shepherd on the adjacent mountains of Bethlehem to attack the lion and the bear, and a little further to the west, in the valley of Elah, to advance fearlessly with his sling and stones against the giant of Gath. Abram has the happy knack, like other unselfish men, of making friends wherever he goes. He is happily on excellent terms with his Amorite neighbours, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. He induces them to take part with him in his rescue expedition, arms his own servants to the number of 318, and making such arrangements as he can for his flocks and his family, sets out in pursuit of the now retiring invaders. It is a new character for the shepherd chief, the man of peace, to whom strife is so obnoxious. But even the rule to live peaceably with all men is qualified by the condition, quote, "inasmuch as lieth in you," end quote, From Hebron to Dan is a distance of more than 120 miles, to traverse which, whatever expedition he might use, would demand several days. But, unencumbered as he was, he could travel much faster than Chedorlaomer's army, and by calculation he might find that they would reach what was afterwards called Dan about the same time as himself. The eastern kings would advance the whole way by the valley of the Jordan and the lakes. Abram would take the more western route, and would be screened by the mountains from observation. Night is always the best season for sudden and unexpected attacks, when the enemy, wearied and disposed to rest, cannot know the extent or resources of the attacking party. So also the division of an attacking force into sections is likely to increase the panic. Adopting this plan, and attacking the enemy in the dark at various points, Abram seems to have gained a complete and easy victory. Many of the Confederates were slain, including, it would seem, Chedorlaomer and the other chiefs, see verse 17. The rest of the forces fled in confusion and were pursued by Abram to Hobah, on the left hand of Damascus. It was altogether a most brilliant affair. Everything that the enemy had carried off was recovered. Lot was rescued from captivity. All was done that could be done to retrieve the disaster. We cannot tell what Lot's feelings were. The narrative is silent on the subject, but the fact that he returned to Sodom, settled there as before, and probably resumed his former occupation, does not tell in his favour. After receiving such a warning from Providence, we should have thought that he would be eager to get out of Sodom, and we cannot doubt that had he expressed this desire to Abram, the generosity that had rescued him at such expense and risk would have permitted him to settle in his neighbourhood as before. But no desire seems to have been expressed by Lot either to get out of Sodom or to return to Abram. If this man is to be saved in the end, he will have to be pulled out of the fire with still greater violence. We meet with a new and great surprise as we return with Abram towards Hebron. That he should be met by the king of Sodom, who had not been carried captive, was only natural, but another royal personage presents himself to the conqueror, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. No great man was ever introduced in the page of history with such a want of explanation or connection. Who was he? How came he to possess the symbolical name Melchizedek, quote, King of Righteousness, end quote? And where was Salem, the city of, quote, peace, end quote, where he reigned? How did he come to be a priest as well as a king, and not a priest of Baal or Ashtoreth, but a priest of Abram's own deity, a priest of the Most High God? Who were his forefathers, and who came after him? Some of these questions, and especially the last, are extremely puzzling. There is no known family or place or office where we may naturally place Melchizedek. We can only think of him as one who had preserved the primitive religion of Noah in its simplicity and integrity, and had rejected all the polytheistic and idolatrous practices that had grown up, north, south, east, and west. Though called a king, he had little influence on the people of the country, dwelling apart, it would seem, from all his neighbours. That he was the patriarch Shem, as some have conjectured, seems out of the question, not only on chronological grounds, but also because there was no reason why this should not have been stated if it was true, and because it was impossible that Shem should have been settled amid a population almost exclusively Canaanite. Many other explanations, equally unwarranted, have been suggested regarding him. At the present day, it is generally thought that he was a local prince of the family of Shem, who had come with his people into the territories of the Canaanites in much the same way as Abram himself, but without Abram's call or mission. His being called a king does not imply much, for the head even of the little city Zoar was called by the royal title. The only greatness of Melchizedek was a moral greatness, the greatness of his priesthood, and it was for this that even Abram, in all the flush of victory, and at the hand of a troop that had routed and slaughtered the mighty kings of the east, acknowledged his superiority and paid him tithes. But for anything that we know of Melchizedek before or after, he might have fallen from the clouds. It is this mystery of origin, this absence of all genealogical connection and historical explanation, this sudden breaking in of a visitor who vanishes into the darkness with equal abruptness, that makes Melchizedek such a historical puzzle. But our ignorance of so many things about him ought not to blind us to the significance of what we do know. His personal name and the name of his kingdom are both significant. Unlike the mass of Oriental rulers, he honored, quote, righteousness, end quote, as the foundation of his government, and, quote, peace, end quote, founded on righteousness, as its end. To most Eastern kings, the end of royal power was to gratify their own inclinations, to humour their pride, and to surround themselves with luxuries and pleasures. Or, if they thought of benefiting their people, it was mainly by war and rapine, by carrying fire and sword into the territories of their neighbours, and enriching their own nation through the plundering and murdering of their foes. Of this style of government, Chedorlaomer and his armies had just been furnishing a characteristic specimen. To these, Melchizedek was a great contrast. In his view, justice lay at the foundation, and peace was the crown of all good government. He foreshadowed that divine ruler of whom it was afterwards sung, quote, "The mountains shall bring peace to the people, and the little hills by righteousness," end quote. That Salem was the place afterwards called Jerusalem seems probable, not only from the resemblance of the name, but also because it lay in the line of Abram's homeward march. But as we have said, Melchizedek's great distinction was that he was priest as well as king. He worshipped the same God as Abram, and doubtless mainly after the same manner. If Salem was Jerusalem, it was barely 20 miles from Hebron, and Abram and Melchizedek could hardly be unknown to each other. Abram may have been under obligations to Melchizedek for spiritual instruction and for wholesome spiritual influence. If we knew all the circumstances, the narrative that now seems so mysterious might be all natural and plain. According to Josephus, Melchizedek fed the army of Abram. To himself, as we learn from Genesis, he gave bread and wine. It has sometimes been attempted to give a mystical and sacramental meaning to this bread and wine, but surely the obvious meaning is the true one. They were refreshments provided for Abram, and possibly for his people, very necessary, and doubtless very grateful, after the strain and toil of the last few days. Bread and wine represented all the products of the soil which God had given for the welfare of man. They were, therefore, fit material symbols of the blessing which Melchizedek was about to pronounce on Abram, and they were well adapted to that sacramental use to which they were first applied 2,000 years afterwards, when they were made to symbolize all that has been brought to man by him whose, quote, flesh is meat indeed, and whose blood is drink indeed, end quote. It was not merely as a friendly neighbor in sympathy with Abram that Melchizedek now presented himself, not merely in the relation in which Barzillai met David in his flight from Jerusalem. His real object was to bless him. He met him as a priest. Quote, he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." End quote. No such benediction had fallen on Abram on his return from Egypt. Quote, "Them that honour me I will honour," end quote, is the rule of divine blessing. Abram had sacrificed his own interests and had risked everything on a mission of mercy, and now he learns how pleasing such service and sacrifice are in the sight of God. Next, Abram gave Melchizedek tithes of all. This was a very substantial and practical recognition of his priesthood. Whether it was a single act, or whether it had been or now became a practice of Abram's thus to recognize Melchizedek and honor his God, we cannot tell. In the present case, it was a tithe of the spoil recovered from the enemy that Abram presented. But the narrative is so expressed as to imply that this was no novelty, that the payment of tithes as due to God was an acknowledged obligation, an obligation which, on this occasion, Abram would be all the more forward to discharge because he had been so conspicuously helped by God, and had won his victory so easily and so completely. The practice of paying tithes, to which this is the first reference in Scripture, was a very general one, not only among the Hebrews, but in other nations both of the East and the West. The Egyptian monuments record some remarkable cases of kings returning from war, offering to their gods immense gifts out of the spoil swept from the enemy's lands. We know how Jacob afterwards promised at Bethel to give to God a tenth of all that God should give to him, and the whole Mosaic legislation shows what an important place the tithe held in the Hebrew economy. Quote, numerous instances are to be found of the practice in heathen nations, Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, Arabians, of applying tenths derived from property in general, from spoil, from confiscated goods, or from commercial profits, to sacred and quasi-sacred, and also to fiscal purposes, namely, as consecrated to a deity, presented as a reward to a successful general, set apart as a tribute to a sovereign, or as a permanent source of revenue." End quote. Quote, "The Phoenicians and Carthaginians sent to the Tyrian Hercules yearly a tithe. The Lydians offered a tithe of their booty, as also the Greeks, especially to Apollo, and the Romans, to Hercules, applied a tenth to the gods." End quote. The word tithe has acquired by use an unsavory meaning. Viewing it as an offering to God, it has a very different aspect according to the spirit of the offerer. To one, it is like lifeblood wrung from him by the force of law, a slice of the most valuable property he possesses, taken for a purpose in which he does not believe or in which he has no interest. To another, it is the loving acknowledgement of innumerable blessings, and of a personal interest infinitely more precious than gold and silver, an offering which it is a relief and a delight to present, because the blessings of which it is the acknowledgement are so overwhelming, and leave the offerer, after all, such an infinite debtor. It needs not to be said in which of these lights Abram regarded the tenth which, through Melchizedek, he offered to God. Next comes Abram's transaction with the king of Sodom. Salem, if it was Jerusalem, was the place where they would naturally separate, the king to return to the plain on the southeast, Abram to Hebron on the southwest. The proposal of the king was that Abram should take all the spoil, restoring only the persons who had been carried off. To this Abram, with a self-denial which some would almost grudge, and a warmth of feeling which they could not understand, would not listen. And this was not a mere matter of feeling, a mere whim of generosity, but a solemn religious determination. Quote, "I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich." End quote. What was the religious principle that moved Abram to this very solemn resolution? It was his loyalty to his God, the possessor of heaven and earth, from whom cometh down every good and every perfect gift. First of all, Abram is too generous a man to enrich himself through the misfortunes of others. But besides that, he sets too high a value on the covenant between him and God to accept of gifts or boons from men. If Abram is to be enriched, it is from the hand of his God that his wealth must come. Not a thread will he take from the king of Sodom. This he has vowed. He has been thinking of the matter before, and lest he should be persuaded to do otherwise, he has fortified his resolution with a vow. God has promised to bless him, and God alone shall fulfill his promise. He would not be indebted to man for what he knew he was to get from God. He was destined to prosper, that he knew, and he would not put it in the power of the king of Sodom to say that his prosperity had in any degree come from him. Nothing should be allowed to obscure the fact that the prosperity of Abram had come from the God he served. His testimony to the one God, the possessor of heaven and earth, must be clear, convincing, indubitable. Only two things were accepted from the application of this rule. The first was the tithe, already paid to Melchizedek, but paid on the principle that it belonged to God already. Morally, the king of Sodom had no control over that. It was God's, and to God's priest it behoved to be paid. The second exception relates to, quote, "that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion." End quote. Actual outlay for food he will take back, for the repayment of that will not make him richer, and the portion of the spoil due to his Amorite allies may be paid, for he has no right to place them under his own self-denying ordinance. But not one farthing more. He will return to Hebron as he came. Men will call him a fool for not availing himself of such a splendid chance of riches. He will tell them that clean hands and a pure conscience are better than the biggest hoard of gold and silver. Did Abram always act in this magnanimous way? Did he act on these high principles in Egypt when he accepted Pharaoh's gifts in return for Sarai, and came home, quote, very rich in cattle, and in silver, and in gold, end quote? Certainly not. His meanness in accepting Pharaoh's gifts was as great as his magnanimity in refusing the king of Sodom's. But in the one case, Abram was not himself, or rather, he was himself, but himself apart from all the higher motives and impulses which fellowship with God imparts. In the other case, his fellowship with God had been regained. Hence his self-denial, his faith, his nobility. Perhaps the very shame with which he looked back on his Egyptian baseness was what impelled him now to lift up his hand to God. Happy the man everywhere, and especially the Christian who, from the very weaknesses and surrenders of the past, can derive strength and courage for the future, and thus, quote, on the stepping stone of his dead self rise to higher things, end quote. The references to Melchizedek, both in the Psalms and in the Epistle to the Hebrews, do not throw any light on the mystery that surrounds him. Rather, perhaps, the mystery is increased, because a fresh testimony is borne to the exalted nature of his priesthood, and to the greatness of the man, quote, to whom even the patriarch Abram gave the tenth of the spoils, end quote. His priesthood is dwelt on as of a higher order than that of Aaron, and thus a fit emblem of the priesthood of the Lord Jesus Christ. A full 1,000 years after his meeting with Abram, a son of the patriarchs reigned in Melchizedek's capital. It was natural for David's thoughts to travel back to that early scene in the history, and think with wonder of the man whose remarkable priesthood made him greater than the great founder of the nation himself. And then, under that remarkable influence by which the natural was often merged in the supernatural, this superiority of Melchizedek was made the basis to David of a revelation respecting the royal son who was to be raised up of his seed, and the divine voice was heard proclaiming, quote, "Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." End quote. What made Melchizedek so much greater than Abram, who was himself the priest of his family, remains and must remain a mystery. The announcement to David respecting Messiah's priesthood was peculiarly solemn, for it was made with an oath, and thus the double lesson was conveyed, that the priesthood of Messiah was to be a priesthood of a most exalted order, and that this was a fact of the utmost importance to mankind, inasmuch as the Lord, in constituting his priest, did so not by a simple affirmation, but with the formality and solemnity of an oath. Probably Abram was the bearer of his own news to his household. Sarai must have had an anxious time, for to a peace-loving shepherd and his company, Kedorlaomer and his allies were a most formidable foe. It must have been a happy hour when he told her of his wonderful victory, then of the release of Lot, and the meeting with the king of Sodom, and last, not least, of the meeting with Melchizedek, the mysterious representative of a greater priest, whose blessing symbolized mercies that only heaven could bestow.